Okay, so let's get started. And as if other people come in, then they can just join the conversation. I just want to thank people for being here. Today's session is, a combination of both the Pre-Health Liaison and the CEC coming together for an interview workshop to focus on, interviewing for, say, graduate or professional school. And so I'll primarily be doing the presentation, but we're also going to have one of my colleagues from my old institution come in. Actually, Christopher, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Christopher Delacerda. I'm right actually down the street from, well, your campus. I'm actually not physically right there anymore. Like many of you, I'm doing things remote. I'm the Recruitment and Student Services Manager in the Office of Recruitment and Multicultural Affairs at Harvard Medical School. As mentioned, I was lucky enough to work with Lindsay previously, so we try to collaborate on some of these things going forward. So I think I'll be chiming in here or there, and then yeah, I'll sort of be here during things to add things where maybe they're relevant for those of you interested in medicine or med school. I've also spent some time working with physical therapy and nursing programs, so if any of the three of you have specific questions around there, I can try to answer those as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Christopher, for being here. And then, so yeah, just moving forward, we're going to have, so basically, today, we're going to have a presentation for the first half hour, do some practice with actual questions, and then we'll debrief the activity afterwards. And we'll also leave some room for announcements for future events. So, just in the interest of time, just what were some answers that you may have had to these questions on this first slide? The questions are, when you hear the term interviewing, what are your initial thoughts, feelings, reactions to the word? Thinking as far back to your first interview, like what have your experiences with interviews been? So they could be for a variety of opportunities. Also, how did you prepare for past interviews? And then last but not least, based on your experiences, what have you found to be strong qualities of a successful interview? So you could answer any one of these. Like, what would you say? Like, does anyone have any answers that they would want to volunteer?
I know for me, just having recently been through my veterinary school interview process for preparing for past interviews, it was definitely like researching the school, like seeing what type of questions have historically like been asked, and then preparing for those questions, and also just making sure that like a lot of times with these graduate school applications, like between the time that you're actually filling out the applications and by the time you are invited for an interview, a lot of time might have elapsed. So you need to I knew that I had to go back and look at my application and make sure that I knew all the ins and outs and anything that they might ask me. And definitely preparing questions for them, because I did have some interviews where my questions were really the driving force of the interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. And then also, yeah, I guess like Christopher, I mean, I know you've done your share of interview prep with students in different health fields. Is there anything that you would want to add?
I think Hannah's definitely spot on, really doing some of that work ahead of time and definitely, reflecting on, well, using all the work that you've already done. Keeping in mind, by the time you're interviewing, it means that you've submitted at least one application to something. If it's graduate professional school, you submitted at least one essay, maybe two or three additionals. So you've done a lot of the heavy work of reflecting on experiences, on thinking through the good, the bad, the mundane. So like making sure that you're kind of researching yourself, as weird as it sounds. Sometimes, especially in the med school side of things, it's like a 13, 14-month process from beginning to end. So it can be 6, 7 months from hitting submit on an application to having your first interview. So, that's a lot of time to kind of forget the, specific pieces of things. So really, just using all the work you've already done for yourself to get an application together is something that can easily be overlooked. So I definitely look at that. And I think that stands for jobs and internships as well, not just thinking about graduate school. So it's one of those universal things that's really helpful.
Thank you for adding that, Christopher. Okay, so let's just moving forward. So some of this you may already know, but it's always just good to recap. Basically interviewing is an opportunity for you to market yourself by offering details about your relevant experiences in a way that you could not in your application material. So after you receive an offer for an interview, you follow up with the school as soon as possible to schedule the date. and time for the interview. And then, so what happens after that? So here are a few key pointers to do. So like, you get the offer, you respond to the school, say, oh yes, I'm available. These are the dates and times. You get all of those logistics cleared up. So what do you do? And some of these are things that you have already said. For example, you might review the school's website and social media, which again, you may have done in the past when you initially applied and researched the school, but then it's about doing it again. And this time around, you're also taking a deeper dive into what makes your graduate or professional program unique in terms of its mission, curriculum, research, community outreach. I know comes up sometimes when I'm talking to students interested in healthcare. Initiatives, what other programming have they done? And then, again, asking yourself, like, how do your academic and career interests intersect with the program of your interest? Something else that I encourage people to do, which again, you may have already done initially, but research the faculty and their areas of expertise. Remind yourself what was on their professional bios, their CVs. Are there articles that they may have published? And then again, this is where you get to assess your strengths, your interests, and think about how can you articulate that this will enable you. How can you articulate the connection between your interests and what they do? This will enable you to advocate for yourself in the interview process. Hold on one second, just checking. Okay, just checking to see if there were questions in the chat box. And then you may or may not have already done this, but if there are opportunities, maybe there were ways for you to attend informational sessions or conduct informational interviews with admission staff, faculty, students, or alums of the program. I know that is something that quite a few students have done in the past when I've advised them on their applications to graduate and professional school. So, the online research is definitely a start. That is the foundation, but I do think there is no replacement for actually being able to talk to people associated with your graduate or professional school of interest. And then last but not least, diversify what resources you use in finding credible information about your school of interest. So, when I say diversify your resources, some of you that might be newer to the search process, I know that, for some of you, you may have already gone through an application process, or some of you who are in this room might not apply to graduate school for a few years and you're coming here as an intro. So let me clarify what I mean when I say diversify your resources. So aside from looking at the school's website and social media, consider reliable third-party resources like news articles about the graduate program or school, graduate school guides, like you may have heard of some of these, like Peterson's, US News, Princeton Review. Depending on your area of interest, maybe it's the Association of American Medical Colleges or the American Veterinary Medical Association. I think that's like another resource that'll help you do more research on the schools that you might be interested. Again, for people here who might be anticipating this application process further in the future. And then, the next resource, which some of you may be aware of or not, is called the Simmons Network. And for those of you who haven't heard of it before, it's basically, a networking platform that is specific to people in the Simmons community. So it can include students, alums, sometimes staff like myself, and also faculty. And it also provides opportunities for you. So if you're thinking about different graduate or professional programs, you can hop onto the Simmons Network to see, hey, are there any alums in your field of interest? So like, what graduate or professional schools did they go to? Maybe there's an opportunity for you to have a Zoom chat with them. The same goes for using LinkedIn for people that may or may not be on the Simmons Network platform. And then, of course, there's being able to use resources like Handshake to find Simmons CEC events. And then I think it's also an ideal time to brainstorm again how your qualifications match up to a school's academics, research, and mission. If this is helpful for you, I know that for some people, so I'm just showing this tab called, let me just share the link in the chat box. It's to the sample T-bar. on the CEC website. And so you could use this worksheet, or you could use a sheet of your own. It really is a way for you to, like, well, I know it says name of company, but you could say name of school, and then think about like what are their requirements for admissions on one side, and then on the other side, think about your qualifications. I know for some of you who may be more visual learners, using a chart like this for your graduate school interview process can be helpful. And yeah, and then also, you could also find more general resources on interviewing on the CEC webpage, and I will drop the link for that in the chat box as well. Okay. So I talked, initially very big picture about just how to research, or do continued research on what you may have already done on a graduate or professional school. Something that you also want to build upon is identifying your most significant accomplishments. So I'm sure that you did it in written form on your application, whether it was on your resume, CV, or maybe potentially essays that you wrote. And so for interview questions, it's good to fit your most significant accomplishments through the CAR framework. So what is the CAR framework? It is, oh, hold on one second. I just need to get in a phone call. Okay, so anyway, so what does CAR stand for? CAR stands for context or challenge. So what were times that you had an opportunity to improve something, or that you had a problem to solve? Think about those times, whether they were in your classes, internships, jobs, extracurriculars, whatever they may be. What actions did you take? So basically, what skills did you use, right? And then what were the results, or what were the positive outcomes of the actions you took? These are like, if you can frame the different stories and examples that you share in your interview process, I think it'll really help you distinguish yourself from others. Because think about it, in an applicant pool, there probably are people who have similar credentials to you in terms of degree, or experiential learning experiences, jobs, whatever it is. So really, it's going to be those specific stories or concrete examples that help you distinguish yourself from the next person. Christopher, is there anything that you wanted to say on this piece?
Yeah, so if you're really specifically thinking, especially about medical school, right, you have 15 experiences you can list there. So and everything comes back to the fact that applications have a finite number of characters or words, depending on how it looks. So within the case of medical school, you can put up to 15 experiences, and there's a word count for like a little blurb for each one. So again, you're constantly cutting out information, including examples of things. So back to that initial point of, it is again incredibly important, as Lindsay's mentioned, to research the school or the company, right, the department, whatever that breakdown is, the faculty members specifically, especially if it's a doctoral program of some kind. But you can always look back at your own stuff, and everything you kind of cut out of what gets put into your application, again, it might fall back into, how do I turn that into a potential answer to an interview question about, a challenging experience with a patient, right? A time with a patient that's significantly different than you, or something like that, right? You can really figure out how to look back at your experiences through the 15 you have to build based around the application itself. And then if you're applying to medical school as well, there's there's something I think I'll mention a little bit later based on, looks like the next slide, so we'll jump forward to that. But again, you've done a lot of the hard work, is the thing that I'll probably keep on hammering home. So I'm sorry if the three of you get tired of that, but I think it's really important to remember that you've done a lot of really quality work by the time you're interviewing. So don't just let that all go to waste.
Thank you, Christopher. So yeah, you mentioned the next slide. Something that I want people to think about is to consider both their technical skills and also just, the competencies that some people might call soft skills, right? I know that for NACE, so NACE is like National Association of Colleges and Employers. It's the professional association that people in my field look to when we're thinking about, these general competencies that all college graduates should have. So these could be things like critical thinking, oral written communications, leadership, career management, global and intercultural fluency. So I think that when I have had people, because I've done quite a few mock interviews with students interested, whether it be in med school, dental school, being a PA. And I think it's those people that were able to speak to both the technical skills as well as those soft skills, or that are transferable to different fields. I think they were the ones who were able to make the strongest arguments for themselves in terms of their qualifications. Or sometimes you might also look at the competencies that are valued by your specific academic or professional association. So like there, as an example, is the AAMC. And Christopher, there was something you wanted to say, I guess, about this slide?
Yeah, sometimes, and again, really thinking about medical school, but this can work for really any profession, is that you can feel really bogged down about how do I talk about what feels like the same thing over and over again at times. And so even if something like, oh, how do I fit in these competencies, and it can feel really sort of cheesy or forced, it can be a way to just think about like your vocabulary a little bit differently, right? And kind of sort of using a thesaurus in a certain sense, that if you're using language that in the case of the ANC companies we're using as an example, right, they're broken down into pre-professional thinking and reasoning and science, right? And they were sort of designed by a set of physicians that work for AAMC. So while everybody might not talk in the competencies, either through AAMC or the NACE competencies you're looking at, they do give a way to kind of frame sort of your thinking a little bit. So sometimes you can kind of feel stuck maybe, or like you're saying the same thing over and over again, and you don't know how to sort of make the case for yourself. So just looking at these as a way to just think about your experiences a little bit differently, and then also tie them to a lens that might resonate a little bit more with, potentially somebody who's actually conducting the interview. So it's just another way to approach your preparation, and really get the most out of it. So when you're practicing, if you kind of connect some of these things, you'll find out what works for you, what feels more natural. But maybe you'll look at one of the competencies and you'll have to literally use the thesaurus to find a word that feels more natural to you, but you're still getting at the same idea, which is, I think, the important piece.
Thank you. Oops. Okay. And something that, usually when people come to me for a mock interview, something that I also advise them when I'm meeting with them is, create a list of interview questions when you're trying to prepare for an interview. Because aside from doing a mock interview with me or maybe coming to a workshop like this, I really do think it's important for people to do that independent interview prep. So what could be on this, list of questions? It could be questions that maybe you have found on, say, resources like frequently asked interview questions, and we'll go over some of them later in this session. Questions that are specific to your prospective school, like what do you think are things people might ask you? And then this is where coming to the CEC and also again talking to people like maybe faculty that mentors of yours, ask them, what do you think are going to be common questions that will be asked of me? And then that could help you shape how you tell your story, how you talk about your most significant accomplishments. And again, this is why I advised you all earlier that if you could go to info sessions or do informational interviews with people associated with these graduate programs, it'll give you more insight in how to do that. And I think, again, I think a lot of you have already said certain things that are that I've mentioned here on the slide, but researching each school and tailor, like what makes that particular school unique. I know that sometimes, when I've worked with, like I think I was working with a student interested in dental schools, and I really kept encouraging that person, to look at each school specifically and ask like what makes each one unique or distinct, because then they could ask more specific, well-researched questions in the interview itself. And so that's also something that, I want you to think about as well, because sometimes when people do mock interviews with me for graduate or professional school, I get to the part at the end where I'm like, hey, do you have any questions for me? And then the student or alum tells me, oh, I haven't thought of that yet. Well, I would say, that is some, I think the questions that you create for the graduate school or professional school, I do encourage you to put as much thought into what you ask them as to preparing answers for the questions that they might ask you, because again, you want to make sure that this is a strong match for you.
Yeah, and make sure that there are things that are actually important to you. So this is where, again, you've done all the work to decide on where to apply for school or for jobs. If you're trying to ask a question that'll sound impressive, but you have no interest in it, it's going to fall flat because you're having somebody's interviewing you who's probably interviewed a ton of people, and it's really clear when somebody's asking something because they think somebody wants us to ask it, rather than it's something that they're curious about, that they find important on some level. Right? Doesn't mean it has to be the most deeply personal question, ever devised. But again, ask questions about things that are important to you, whatever that means. You got to decide that for yourself. But just doing it because you think it's going to impress somebody with the complexity of the question or something, or the specificity, not necessarily the case. Somebody in a recent session asked one of our faculty something wildly specific about their work in a group session, and it just didn't make any sense. Like it wasn't sort of like the place to ask about something that they wrote like 9 years ago. And even talking to the faculty member afterwards, it was one of these things. It was like, even I don't remember precisely what I wrote in that paper. Like it's a part of my work now. Like it informs on some level what I do, but it wasn't the context that you'd want to like pull a quote from a paper 7 years ago, right, with three other authors. So kind of just keeping in mind that you want to ask questions that are important to you, not that you think sound impressive or important, and be consistent across multiple institutions too. So when you're interviewing at multiple medical schools or dental schools or whatever it is, asking similar questions at each place is going to help you make your decision in the future when you're going to decide which offer to accept and which to decline. And when you're applying to jobs and internships, it's the same thing, right? You kind of you'll get a feel for what's important to you, and you get different answers from different schools, and you'll find out which one kind of meets your needs. And when you ask the same question of multiple people during an interview day, same thing happens, right? If you get very different answers to the same thing, then you kind of got to figure out what's going on there. If they're all similar-ish, then is it a good similar or a bad similar, right? You like what everybody's saying or you dislike it. So it helps you really pull those things apart when you get to your decision-making process in the end.
Thank you, Christopher, for sharing those insights. And that's exactly why I asked him to come here, just because I know that, he sees on the other end, just like what some of the experiences have been with these interviews. I mean, and, again, to speaking about something simple that you really care about, like recently, like I would say in the fall, I did a mock interview with someone who was really interested in healthcare in rural areas, right? So that was so for that person, that's going to be a consistent question of the medical schools to understand like the outreach and, opportunities to work more in those areas. So again, doesn't have to be the deepest question, but something that authentically connects to you. And so aside from just speaking about the content of the actual question, something that I want you all to think about is also how are you presenting yourself? So answer with confidence in your competence. The school requested an interview with you. That means you did something right in the application material. So now is the time to really, in the interview format, to show your strengths. Be aware of your nonverbal communication. So not just the content of your actual words, but what is your tone of voice like, your eye contact, posture, overall body language. And then also be aware of your setup, especially for a video chat, since we're doing that these days. So you might want to ask yourself, what do you need to do before the interview and what do you need to do during the interview? So examples of things you can do before the interview. So test your technology in advance. I even did that before the session today, just making sure my sound works, the internet, all that good jazz. Finding a quiet space to set up and a clear view of your room with as few distractions in the background as possible. Also make sure that the lighting in the room is good so that the interviewer has a clear view of your face. And then also dress professionally as you would for an in-person interview. I also think just dressing more professionally can also just help with your attitude and the way that you interact. Like I know it definitely does for me. And then also during the interview, look at the camera so that you can make eye contact with the interviewer. Position yourself so that the screen image is of your face and shoulders. And again, just being aware of your nonverbal language when you're actually in the interview itself. And for those who are curious about more specific tips, I know this says Skype interview tips as a resource, but honestly, I think the tips on here are really applicable across different platforms that you might be doing these interviews on. And then, and then we're going to talk about following up after an interview. So after an interview, be sure to send a thank you message within 24 hours to the interviewers. Reaffirm your strong interest in the program. And, if you didn't get the contact information for all of the interviewers, at least be sure to send a thank you to the primary interviewer. And then also, determine when to send follow-up questions. So toward the end of your actual interview, you can ask about next steps in the application process. And then if you don't hear a decision by the estimated timeline, then you can follow up with school admissions. If for some reason you forgot to ask about the application timeline during the interview, that can be a question you email to the school after the interview. And then again, think about this as an opportunity to just maintain a positive connection. So whether or not you receive an admissions offer, the interview process still was an opportunity for you to practice interviewing and networking with people in your field of interest. So just know that regardless of how you feel an interview goes, it's always good practice and there's still value in that experience. And then, so let's get to the point. Okay, yeah, so we're right on the dot for 5 o'clock to just give you opportunities to practice interviewing. So, and I could also put these questions in the chat box as well. So, the first one, I'll basically put you into breakout rooms, but the first question is, tell me about yourself. And then if you get into pairs, people can take like 5 minutes each answering that question. So that's 10 minutes right there. For the next 10 minutes, your next question could be, what do you know about the current issues of your field? So again, 5 minutes for one person, 5 minutes for another. And then last but not least, the third question is, why did you choose to go into your field? And then that's an opportunity, again, for both people to answer. And then after everyone gets their practice, we can come together as a group and then debrief that experience and also just talk about strategies that everyone can use for tackling these 3 questions. Before we move forward, does anyone have any questions? Okay, hold on one sec. Let me just stop the share. And then let me put people into breakout rooms. Okay. All right, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to, send me a message on the chat box, and throughout the half hour, I'll be able to send you all like reminders on time, okay? All right, I'll see you in a bit. How was that? How was the practice?
I think it went well.
Awesome. What about for you, Jacqueline?
It was good. I got to learn more about Hannah as well.
Awesome, awesome. Hi, Sydney. Hi, Christopher. How'd it go? I was just asking Hannah and Jacqueline about it, how to do the practice rounds.
It's really interesting. Chris actually gave me a lot of pointers in that I had like the main ideas, but I should probably be a little bit more specific and clear with my responses and not worry too much about like the creativity of it, as that doesn't always seem to work in students' favors.
Okay, that's good to hear. Thank you for those pointers, Christopher. Let me do a screen share so we could get back to the lovely PowerPoint. Okay, everyone has that slide up now? Okay, so yeah, it sounds like, yeah, it went well with some of you. You got some tips. Actually, yeah, like Jacqueline and Hannah, after you gave each other your answers, what were some pieces of feedback? I guess actually, well, what do you think went well for all of you who did this, right? Like, what were the parts where you're like, oh, I think I did this well, or my partner did this well, and I think this is something I might want to consider for my actual interviews? So so let's start thinking about strategies, right? So the first question that you had the first 10 minutes to talk about was tell me about yourself. What were certain things that you might have brought up or your partner brought up when answering this question? And anyone could come off of mute to share or type in the chat box if that's easier for you.
I mentioned my name, my pronouns, the major that I have chosen, and then my interests and the orgs that I am a part of on campus. That was pretty much it.
Yeah. So basically, this is an opportunity for you to give your elevator pitch. There's let me see if I could find the resource. Okay, I'm gonna put the link to this in the chat box for all of you. And by the way, I could also just share the PowerPoint with the links to people if they want it, if you want this as a reference for later. But basically it's like if you've all ever heard of an elevator pitch, elevator speech, or sometimes, like on this resource that I shared with you, we call it a brief infomercial on yourself. Basically, what, like, here's some key areas that you might want to include. So Sydney, yes, you mentioned, your name, Simmons, you mentioned your pronouns. So yeah, personal things that you think are important. Like sometimes when I'm in job or when I was in graduate school interviews at one point, I mentioned my hometown just because I thought it was something, very basic about myself, but still also informed some of my interests for moving and choosing the career that I did, right? And then, like you said, Sydney, bachelor's degree, maybe if you have certain minors, sometimes people include that as well. Professional and extracurricular experiences. So it's not, sometimes I've seen people answer these questions and they're trying to list every job, internship, and it's like, no, it's not list everything, but list the key jobs, internships, community service, and other experiences that have really shaped your interests, right? And again, like when you're thinking about strengths, skills, or accomplishments, to also share in the answer to tell me about yourself. It's not every strength, not every skill, but again, what are like the top strengths or skills, accomplishments that you want to bring up? And then, because remember, this is usually an introductory question, so it's really meant to give an overall snapshot of yourself, and then just know that later you could always dive deeper. And then I think, in the context of an interview, I think what's nice to do with an elevator pitch or personal infomercial is to at the end connect how your background and experiences led you to this program. So toward the end, like at the end of your pitch, you might say, oh yeah, so I did this and that, and this is what I've accomplished, and this is why, I chose to apply to this program because, and then it's an opportunity for you to show that you have seen that alignment between yourself and what that graduate or professional school is doing. Christopher, did you have anything else to add?
It's also potentially a way to, use the work you've done to figure out a little bit about who you're interviewing with, or sort of, again, the program, company, division, again, whatever it might look like. As Lindsay mentioned, like the idea of moving around. I'm originally from Central California. So like if I know I'm talking to somebody who graduated from a University of California school, I generally mention where I went to school, but again, in context, it might not always make sense. But if I know I'm talking to somebody who's a UC alum, then I'll almost certainly mention it. Because it just creates another, you can sort of connect on the California component, or if they specifically went to UC Santa Barbara, then we end up talking about the beach, even though I'm not a big beach person, which I know is blasphemous for most, but it's just not my thing. But again, we can talk, and I can even talk about that. Like that can be a nice sort of conversation point where I'm like, yeah, but I went to the beach twice over 4 years, going to school there. But so you can kind of find those ways. Again, you've got to figure out how it feels natural in there, right? You don't want to like stop and sort of say, and I see that you also trained at UC Santa Barbara. Like, you don't want to make it so robotic, but you kind of figure out those ways where, what are those small touches, and that's easy when you have a interview schedule ahead of time. It doesn't always work especially for medical schools, you don't always know who you're interviewing with until the day of, just for logistical reasons. It's not even like I try to, trip you up. It's just sometimes, we don't give you the name until the night before that morning, in case something changes. So not always possible, but when you have enough of a schedule ahead of time, especially for like a PhD program where you kind of know who you're applying to work under and things like that, you might have that ability to, mention that, oh, yeah, and I spent a couple of years at the University of Virginia, which I did. And again, people that attended UVA or work there usually have a really strong connection to it. So it's again another talking point about like, oh, like what'd you think about Charlottesville? And so it opens the doors for, just those ways to connect with somebody on a personal level that's true to your experience, not super cheesy, and just easy to sort of slip into like this kind of conversational short version of your entire life. And as Lindsay said, don't try to tell your entire life in 30 seconds. It's never going to work. But you figure out those key pieces.
Thank you, Christopher. And I think, he what Christopher keeps raising is like, also, how does something feel? Like there are so many awesome things about all of your backgrounds and experiences that I'm sure you could share. But, again, you're trying to find what is a strong match for you. So, find opportunities to find the things that really matter to you, that really interest you. And then that's also where you'll get a sense of how you match up to the people who are interviewing you. And then so moving on to question 2, like, what do you know about the current issues in your field? Does anyone want to share how they answered this question?
So I tweaked it for Sydney a little bit, and it was sort of, what do you think is one of the biggest challenges in your field right now? And sort of an idea that Sydney mentioned interest potentially in going to med school. Which I think she gave a really good answer about thinking about sort of how race in the U.S. impacts access to healthcare, access to medical school, things like that. So I thought it was a good way to make it really clear sort of what some of Sydney's interests were and her concerns in the field. And then we talk a little about how you can pull on more specific things, some more thinking about, in the case of a class you mentioned she was taking, there were some clear ways that she could pull some of that information in there. As you get a little bit closer to applying for anybody, then, there's ways to pull in more that you've learned about, what's affecting the field and sort of what is or what will be the biggest thing impacting medicine. Like that's a question that comes up pretty regularly, actually. Even with the nursing and PT and OT programs that come up, I've worked for in the past. Some version of that, like, is what's going to impact the healthcare industry. So if you're interested in health in any capacity, then it's good to think about that because somebody will likely ask a version of that as well. So I think Sydney gave a great answer. We just tweaked it a little bit, tried to broaden it some.
Great. And Hannah, Jacqueline, is there anything that you wanted to say about this second question?
I think Jacqueline also kind of focused on kind of what Sydney was saying and like health disparities and inequities and everything in the medical field. For me, I focused on like antibiotic resistance and like animal welfare issues.
Mm-hmm. No, great. And I think, and I think regardless of what fields you are interested in, I think some general ways to think about it are like, what are certain issues of ethics that I might want to consider? What are legal implications? Some of you have already referenced like DEI issues, justice, and then also, like right now, like the major topic in like healthcare, or one of them anyway, is like COVID and all of the implications of that. And like Christopher said, in a few years from now, maybe it's a different question. So yeah, I think those are just some broad ways to think about it. And then the last question, why did you choose to go into your field? Yeah, how was this question for people? Like, what were things that maybe you felt like you might have liked about your answer or your partner's answer, or you could also speak to like maybe what you found challenging about trying to answer this question.
I feel like whenever I thought about this question, I found it difficult to find a reason that would like make myself seem like unique. I feel like a lot of the reasons people give are very generic across the board. Like obviously, like for me, like I love animals, I love science and like medicine, and putting them together is veterinary medicine, and just like relishing in like the human animal bond and working with that and fostering that. But like with veterinary students, I feel like that's a very common thing to be said. I mean, luckily I was never really asked that question, surprisingly, but yeah, so but when I was thinking about it and preparing for it, I found that difficult.
Yeah. And Christopher, just with your work with students in healthcare, like how might you respond to that? Like, how does someone find an answer? Because you speak about like, how do you find the answer that's authentic, but also one that doesn't feel so generic either?
Yeah, I think it's about sort of when you practice it, it's about getting to a really personal level and then backing out some, right? Like I think that's the way you think about it, right? There's not ever really going to be like this singular experience that's like, and that's the moment I decided, like, I want to be a veterinarian. Of course, there could be like for people, sometimes there is a specific thing, but usually you can reflect on that after like 7 to 10 years in your field, and then you can realize where the inflection point was. You don't necessarily know it when it's happening. So it's figuring out like really trying to get at this sort of personal understanding of what is it, right, and about being a veterinarian that really just grabbed you, right, and thinking on it and figuring that out, right, and you kind of just figure out kind of this story on in some way, right, and you can also figure out how did you, what did you sort of whittle away to get to your point in terms of like medicine. If you talk about medicine, right, you want to help people. Well, there's lots of ways to help people, right? So you narrowed it down from any way you could help people to helping people by through medicine. And then within medicine, there are any number of careers, but you decided that you wanted to be a physician to help people, right? And so there was some decision making in there, even if it was a little sort of, in your subconscious in some way, but you got to that point. So it's kind of trying to unpack that and not worrying about it being unique, not worrying about it being unique, but worrying about it being really sort of a really clear crystallization of your reasoning. And that in itself will make it unique, which sounds kind of backwards and probably unbelievable. But if you worry about being tricky and unique and sort of a gimmick, then it will almost certainly come off as a gimmick, which is not a good thing, right? Because you have to also remember that the people interviewing you, at HMS, they're all physicians or they're third or fourth year students. So they're thinking, do I see this person as a colleague in the future? Like that's legitimately a part of the thought process. So if your entire selling point is a gimmick, like do you think that's going to go over well, especially if it's like done in a mediocre fashion, which it usually is. So it's really getting to really why do you want to do this, and that's where I know if you're in multiple sessions with Lindsay, you'll hear her bring up the idea of sort of like reflection quite often, right, and really thinking about your experience and stuff, and it's really valuable because that's what you want to do, and that's what you're doing through your preparation of your application materials and everything to get to that answer. So I think that's how you get to it. So it feels a little bit cheesy. Practice some more until maybe just change the language so it doesn't feel so cheesy, but you've got to get to this clear understanding of why you want to do it. And that's also like my consistent answer to what is HMS looking for. Everybody asks that, and that's one of the things is like a clear understanding of why you want to do this. And just knowing that by the time you're answering this question in person, like you've had a primary application, a secondary application, multiple experiences, that is recommendation. Like, so there's a lot that's gone to that point that somebody kind of knows about you as well. So again, focus on your clear, succinct, why I want to do that. That's true to you. And it'll stand out more than worrying about a gimmick or worrying about standing out.
Thank you, Christopher. And I'll also say this, when I've conducted different mock interviews with people, um, you know, it's interesting. I think, especially when it comes to health related fields, sometimes there are people who can point to the moment it dawned on them that they wanted to enter such and such field. And maybe it might have been like, yeah, like a health issue related to someone they love, or maybe it's the animal, if we're talking about, veterinary. But then there's also, I think it's also like there have been moments along the way in that person's lived experience, whether it's been in their classroom, in their labs, in their internships, jobs, shadowing. There have also been moments of crystallization along the way. So even when certain people, even if you're not someone who can necessarily identify that inflection point, as Christopher said, you probably could identify key points of your lived experiences, again, in the classroom, outside of the classroom, where you're like, okay, this field is in fact for me, like these moments that really confirm. So that's where you can provide those concrete examples or stories of of what you've experienced, and also, what you've accomplished, right? Like you could say like, oh, I took such and such class, but then talk about like not just like how that class inspired you, but also like maybe what you were able to accomplish in a project, right? Or if you talk about a shadowing or internship experience, talk about what you were able to accomplish and learn while you were in that position. And that will be helpful for you to also, again, tell your narrative about why your experiences now lead up to you interviewing with the graduate program or professional program in front of you. So just, takeaways from this, it's preparing for an interview. So you've all made a big step in just being here. And I, of course, would, encourage you to continue with that process, whether it be one-on-one with me or finding other resources to do that. Presentation, it's not just about the content of what you say, but how are you presenting yourself professionally throughout the interview process. Third, practice. We know interviews are not natural conversations. That's why it takes practice to make it feel as natural and as authentic for you as possible in the way Christopher has encouraged us to think. And then last but not least, I've said this before, again, whether or not you gain admission to a particular graduate or professional program, you still have the opportunity to build rapport with faculty and professionals in your field. And this will still, again, be useful experience just for future networking and interviewing. So what I would also just recommend after this workshop is, continue to practice either independently or with someone else on your own. You're welcome to do a mock interview with me or one of my colleagues in the CEC. You can just schedule that on Handshake. And you can also make use of this resource we have called Big Interview, where you could record, you could customize an interview for yourself, and then you could record it on this online platform and then play it back. And then that way you can observe actually how you are. Like, you have the experience of doing it and then looking at yourself after the fact to see what you might keep with your interviewing strategy and what you might change. So, and then also just so you know, like, our next workshop will be Thursday, April 1st, 3 to 4 p.m. And then that's where you could learn more about networking and just how to do that in this field. So I'm going to stop the share right now. Before we wrap up, does anyone else have other questions or comments for myself or Christopher? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you everyone very much for being here. I'll stick around for a few more minutes if you have individual questions for me, but thank you and have a great rest of your night. All right.